Welcome to Bodhrán Experimentation and Innovation, a virtual lecture recital with Colin Harte. This has been made possible by CUNY, Queen's College, with funding from the Departments of Irish Studies and the support of the Music Department. I'd like to give special thanks to the head of the Irish Studies, Sarah Covington, for providing support and funding for this, and with the help of Susan Davis in the Music Department as well. This lecture recital is based upon a book that should be coming out in May, entitled The Bodhrán Experimentation, Innovation, and the Traditional Irish Frame Drum, written by myself, and you can find this with the University of Tennessee Press. I'll put a link below, and it's part of the Charles K. Wolfe Music Series. This talk is really a preview. It goes into certain aspects of the book. It's not an exhaustive talk about everything that's in the book, so there's a lot of things that will not be covered. We're going to take particularly a look at some of the history of the bodhrán, and we're going to look at experimentation and innovation in regards to bodhrán making and performance practice. Elements of pedagogy, which are found in the book, there's a whole chapter on that, repertory in terms of key recordings, videos, etc. I won't be diving into, but you can take a look at that when you purchase the book. Some of the wonderful work by educators such as Junior Davies, Bodhrán Academy, or Kraken, the Summer Academy out in the Aran Islands, or the myriad of online video lessons, myself included. I offer one called Bodhrán Around the Globe, Bodhrán workshops, which is put on by Robbie Walsh, and a host of other educational resources will not be covered in this lecture. But we'll be focusing on the history, bodhrán making, and bodhrán playing. The intended audience for this is academics, bodhrán enthusiasts, Irish traditional music enthusiasts, world music enthusiasts, and of course, just the general public who may be curious about that. So I'll try and cover as much as I can with this and explain it to the best of my abilities. So let's dive in, shall we? We're going to start with the history of the bodhrán. When we think about the bodhrán itself, it's obviously a frame drum, traditionally a wooden shell with a goat skin, which is hit with either a tipper, meaning a sort of drumstick, or by the hand. We find this obviously coming out of rituals in Ireland, being associated with Irish traditional music, but through its development, and rather rapid development I might add, it's being included in non-traditional musics outside of Irish traditional music as well. And so we're going to be exploring some of the musical possibilities and organological possibilities, meaning the instrument's construction. Some of the ways that we see and hear this is in recordings, obviously, videos, in concert halls, as well as sessions, where the typical role of the bodhrán is to provide percussive accompaniment following the melodies or tunes that we hear in Irish traditional music. So many of you will be familiar with that and are well aware of that, but I'd like to put that out there just in case you're not as familiar with this instrument as some. Now, the bodhrán itself is obviously a frame drum, and as a frame drum, it shares certain commonalities with other frame drum traditions. You can find the dira in Afghanistan, the tar, the rick, the bendir, Middle East and North Africa, the tamborello from Southern Europe. We think of the tambourine in general. There's a lot of commonalities there. There's obviously a whole host of frame drum traditions we find throughout Africa, Asia, North America. I think the simplicity of its design and the resonance of the drum, of just having a skin over a wooden frame, lends itself to being found throughout different traditions, being played in different ways, whether it's open, a ringing sound with the hand, or with sticks. But it's important just to kind of think about some of the shared histories and commonalities in terms of playing, and how that might influence players and makers, and also looking at the particularities of the bodhrán itself. When we think about, there's a number of hypotheses regarding the origins of this drum. Scott Morrison has posited that the Celts possibly brought this frame drum to Ireland as they were moving through westward through Europe and eventually to Ireland. since its origins, and we'll get into this in a second, are connected with a sieve, which was used as sort of a winnowing sieve that separated cereal grain from chaff. It's a very old piece of farming technology that we find throughout Europe, and even eventually originating from Mesopotamia. So it's a very old technology. So if we think about this as being interconnected, particularly the Byrne is, when we think about the sieve, something that in the wintertime, when it wasn't being used for harvests, would be above the fireplace, would be possibly used as a percussion instrument, as it would have been dried out and have a bit of resonance there. And so certain sieve artifacts have been found at the National Museum of Ireland, going way back nearly to the Bronze Age in terms of sieves, not necessarily labeled as just being the Byrne, obviously, but the fact that that technology is that old in Ireland suggests that the instrument itself could have been as far back as Scott Morrison posited that the Celts have possibly brought it. Now, in terms of actual evidence of this, although there's a sieve, there isn't just a separate drum. Some of these things break down quite quickly, but there's no evidence of that actual drum. There's evidence of the sieve. A second hypothesis is that it possibly came with the Romans when they were in the British Isles. There are Roman mosaics depicting musicians playing music and being accompanied with a small frame drum. A third hypothesis is that the Vikings possibly brought it with a fish skin or reindeer skin oval frame drum from Lapland, Finland, during their conquest of Ireland from 800 AD to year 1014 or so. There's not a ton of conclusive evidence, and so it remains rather speculative and intriguing. It's interesting to think about the great flute player and Byrne player from Sligo, Seamus Tansey, sort of mythologizes the origins of the Byrne, discussing it as a religious instrument that would have been used on certain occasions, Midsummer's Eve, the summer solstice, on a bonfire night, which, say June 23rd, when the sun is at its highest in the sky. He thought of it as using along with bonfires to celebrate this, that it was a pagan ritual. Also being played at Christmas time, the day after Christmas, December 26th, or Boxing Day, which is the old winter solstice. This is the Wren Boys' day as well, if you're familiar with that tradition, which we'll dig into. The sun, they believed in the old times, died in the sky at that time. In the days coming up to what we call Christmas, they would beat the Byrnes to bring it alive in the sky. And when St. Stephen's Day came and they saw the sun coming, they thought the sun came alive with the beating of the drums. And if you notice, the Byrne itself is in a circle just like the sun. So there's that sort of mythology that goes along with it as well. In terms of thinking about evidence in terms of domestic origins of the Byrne, scholars really speculate that the Byrne itself comes from the round sieve or winnow used in rural farming. And as I had mentioned before, this is a very old piece of farming technology. The sieve was commonly used in Ireland up until about the 1930s. It was called in lowland Scotland and England the wicht in Ireland, the Dallin or Dolan in the Isle of Man, the Croder Cruhan in Cornwall, England. The Dallin itself was made by stretching an animal skin over a branch that was cut along its length. Sometimes the skins were what was available, so either goats, calves, deer, donkeys, horses, greyhounds, even rabbit. They were treated in various ways in terms of treating the skins, whether using lime or burying in the ground, removing the dirt and the hair, and keeping the sort of remaining fat and slowly stretching the skin about the frame. And so if we look at the sort of similarities to some of these, and here's the sieve here. As you can see, it doesn't have a skin on the background, but there would have been a skin just past where that mesh is there to actually catch the cereal grain. I took this of a photo of the Wecht in St. Fagan's National Museum of History in Wales. And so this kind of gives you an idea that with a skin behind it, this is something that would have been used, obviously, for farming, but in the wintertime when it was above the fireplace and it was a bit dried, it was certainly something that you could hit and use to make a sort of percussive sound, if you will. And so it's within the imagination, anyways, that would make sense in terms of the origins, the domestic origins, anyways, of the drum in Ireland. I think it's interesting to mention here, as we're talking about commonalities between frame drum traditions. If we look at in ancient Sumer of southern Mesopotamia, one of the earliest documented urban civilizations of mankind, going back to circa 3500 BC, the noun adapa or adapu, which was used to describe both a grain of measure and a square frame drum. We look at medieval North Africa, the noun gerbal had a dual meaning referring to both a sieve and a round frame drum. In the Iberian Peninsula, we also find that at least in Aragon during the 14th century, a skin tray or similar utensil was also by the name of pandero. And so if you're familiar with the Spanish percussion traditions of the pandero or the sort of larger tambourines, I think it's interesting to think that in these different cultures, sort of dual name for both the agrarian tool and the musical instrument. So it would make sense that this would be the case as well in Ireland. If we look at the Topographia Hibernica, which was written in 1185 by the Welsh Norman royal clerk Gerald of Wales, a questionable source in the sense that he had very much an agenda and was trying to portray the Irish in a negative light to justify the Norman invasion in Ireland. However, he did know that the Irish delighted in the music of the heart and the tympanum, so just thinking of it as possibly a frame drum or tambourine, while he noted the Scottish used the harp, tympanum, and crowd, which is sort of a bowed lyre. So although the frame drum isn't named as a bodhrán as such, there's an observation of some sort of percussive instrument in Ireland, which comes from a foreign chronicler. We look at the 15th century, the Rosa Anglica, which is sort of a medical text, references the bodhrán in relation to tympanitis. This medical text notes that one symptom that occurs is that the stomach resounds when struck like a tympan or a bodhrán. This is one of the oldest, in terms of literature, citations of the word bodhrán. And so this early reference to the bodhrán as a percussion instrument indicates a possibly lengthy existence in Ireland. Now, as I mentioned, it's difficult to come upon evidence in terms of you're scrapping together texts, an old sieve from the Bronze Age and such. One of the useful sources really is paintings. And so we'll see here, this is from the National Gallery of Scotland, and it was painted in 1781, but we see here a lively scene, and we can see right here the use of a very large frame drum. Looks to my eye anyway like a bodhrán anyways, and it's being played with the hand. So certainly if this is being painted, this sort of instrument was in existence. We see, let's see here, another example which features a bodhrán. It's Snapapple Night, which is exhibited at the Royal Academy in London. And the painting displays a festive house party hosted by Father Matthew Horgan of County Cork. And you can see there's food and drink. And there's a small group of musicians here performing. There's some dancing. And tucked away in the corner is this guy playing a large bodhrán. As you can see, it has the jingles as well, it's being struck with a stick there, which is interesting to see that there's this documentation, and that would have been from 1833. We take a look here, another painting from 1842 shows a bodhrán with jingles and is being played with the hand to accompany a flute player. So I think it's interesting just to kind of look at this and seeing some of the painting documentation that we have of the frame drum, harkening back earlier than many have possibly thought. So in terms of early recordings of the bodhrán, if we're jumping ahead to the 1920s and 30s, you have the recording industry emerges with its epicenter in New York and to a lesser degree in Chicago. And we hear some recordings, which you can find on the old 78 RPMs of bodhrán accompaniment by John Reynolds. You can find playing along with the flute player Tom Morrison. You can hear him, it's not a loud, resounding resonant drum playing that we might associate with, say, Peadar Mercier of the Ethnomusicological and the Chieftains. In fact, it sounds a bit more muted, so that may be the distance from the microphone and the possible dampening of the drum, either by pressing against the body or possibly with the hand. But it's certainly not an open ringing sound. He's also on another recording with Tom Morrison, John Reynolds there, and the pianist Ed Gagan. So you can hear some of his recording, which is, interesting to just take a listen to. Now, as I mentioned earlier with Tansey's sort of mythology of the Bodhrán, there's certainly had a tradition, the Bodhrán being used as a ritual, processional ritual instrument, focused around harvest festivals. Think about St. Stephen's Day, aka Boxing Day, on December 26th, May Day or May 1st, St. Bridget's Day on February 1st. And you can see some wonderful photos here documented by Kevin O'Donoghue with the Irish Folklore Commission. And so we have some photos here. You can see from 1947, a Wren Boys procession with Bodhráns aplenty there, accompanying pipers. And many of them looking custom made, so in the sense of there's not a uniformity necessarily in their design. Obviously, it's a frame drum, but some having jingles, some not. And we can see another one here with a very thick tipper with another player, and this is 1946 as well. As you can see, different sizes to the drum, whether it's jingles, tippers, or by hand. And obviously, they would be going in costume, as we can see here, and we'll just go back for a second there. You can see other costumes as well, going from door to door, house to house, looking for a small compensation for later purposes, let's say. And so this is associated with a more pagan ritual, which would be the hunting of the wren and the burying of the wren. This ritual has its roots in ancient Celtic and Christian lore. Obviously, it was common to hear the Bodhrán being played at festive occasions, particularly if we're thinking about this. Birds, particularly ravens and wrens, were viewed as possible liminal intermediaries capable of crossing between realms, right? The spirit world, the living world, and possessing divine powers. The Druids used the flight of birds to predict things. So, if we think about just the way in which this manifests itself, one of the discussions of why they chase and hunt the wren, it's believed, one of these is that it was believed that when St. Stephen was hiding from anti-Christian persecutors, a wren flew out of the bush that St. Stephen was behind and thus gave away his position. He was captured and executed. The wren is killed during the Wren Boy ritual, in part due to its betrayal of St. Stephen. It should also be noted that similar folkloric stories exist in which wrens reveal Irish military positions by tapping on war drums during 17th century campaigns against Oliver Cromwell's army and during a campaign against the Williamites. There's the story of the wren being the king of all birds. I'm sure you've heard that there's the Wren Boy song that goes along with this as well. When I was talking with Seamus Tansey, he was discussing some of the folklore behind the sort of killing of the wren, that the wren, in his desire to become the king of all birds, mischievously tried to get ahead even further than the eagle, and really decided to fly on the back of the eagle, and thus try and get as high as possible to be the king of all birds. And so since he was the king of all birds, it was felt that he had to be sacrificed as he was able to get as close to the sun as possible in a ritual for the rebirth of the sun. And we had kind of, Tansey discussed this during St. Stephen's Day when they were trying to bring the sun back, that there was a whole ritual associated with bringing the sun back to life, and that if the king of all birds was the wren, able to get the highest because he had flown on the back of an eagle, that killing it would help bring back the sun. And of course, this is associated with the Bodhrán to flush out the wren and to execute it. So it's interesting to kind of think about some of these origins and thinking about these processes. Obviously, Wren Boy tradition continues to this day. You can find it particularly throughout the west of Ireland. And so some of the barons that would have been made would have been for that. If you go back far enough, they would have been one of the civs we were talking about. So let's talk a bit about early makers as well. So we have Sonny Davey here from Sligo, Ballymote, County Sligo. And so I was able to talk to his son, Owen Davey, some other makers as well. But he built his first barron in 1917 and began accompanying musicians in halls and crossroad dances. He learned how to cure skin from a Donegal man, and he actually began to have a workshop in 1927 where he was commercially producing barons with the insignia Souvenir of Ireland for the burgeoning tourist trade. If you want to think about this, I mean, before the late 1950s, barons were constructed in rather small quantities, 5 to 6 a year, by local makers who employed different methods of construction and skin curing. In a discussion with Seamus O'Kane, he was estimating that 1 out of possibly 30 barons constructed would be really usable. The skins could be improperly treated, stretched, and attached to the shell, resulting in a skin that was either too loose or too tight. And these drums were not played every night, not necessarily even having players who were practicing. They would typically be beaten either with the hand or with a heavy stick. The skins were quite thick and were quite rough. So in nature, to kind of think about early baron making, certainly not in the quantities that we see today. And so if we think about Sonny Davey, which is interesting here as a baron maker, he was also a baron player. So adjusting the drums and making some of the best drums at the time, because he was obviously testing these out and playing with other musicians. When I spoke to his son, Owen Davey, he was discussing, that his father had a real mind for craftsmanship and building a variety of things in addition to drums. So in terms of building his own building his own drums very early on and using tin cans to cut out little jingles to put on them, even thinking about building his own drum kit as well, in terms of a snare drum, is interesting to think about, that we have a real craftsman working away at it. Another early baron maker was worth mentioning is Paddy Clancy, who was also based out of West Limerick, but was also making barons out of interest. And this was a little later on that he was thinking about kind of producing them for a number of players, but in small quantities once again. Another baron player of note, particularly as a maker here, is Charlie Byrne. And here's a great picture of him. Charlie Byrne's barons were highly regarded, particularly by players such as Johnny McDonagh, Tommy Hayes, Mossy Griffin, amongst many others. He typically built drums with 18-inch diameters to 20-inch diameters and a 4-inch shell. Byrne typically built these drums and then would invite players over to pick out the drum that they liked best. He wasn't necessarily custom building them for individual players, but just creating drums and then selling them. He used cow manure in urine to cure the skins itself, and he had a workshop in the back of his house and would keep them in the back room and different areas in his shed where he could house them and then, of course, display them. He also would sell these around at the Fleadh, the Irish Music Festival, yearly festival, and would sell them that way as well as a possible means of distributing the drums. And of course, you could go and drive down to his house as well. And we'll be talking a little bit about Charlie Byrne and his relationship with certain players, such as Tommy Hayes and Mossy Griffin, and thinking about that dynamic between them. But I wanted to just sort of set the tone here so you're aware of some of the makers and players and what we're talking about. So, if we think about the emergence of the baron, so we've talked about some of the history, the sort of speculative origins of it, the way in which it slowly developed, different makers, citations for the drum, rituals, thinking about the Wren Boys and that procession and some of the mythology, its possible pre-Christian roots. To really think about the emergence of the baron in a much larger stage and a larger context and a much greater awareness of the drum. I mean, you had Bodhrán traditions in Limerick, obviously great hand striking, meaning just using your hand to produce sound on the drum instead of a stick, up in Sligo. That would have predated the 1950s that we're going to talk about right now with Culture-Colin here that we see with the great Sean O'Riordan on the harpsichord here, or piano, I'm sorry, and Peadar Mercier here on Bodhrán. But we have a number of things happening from the 1950s that's important to kind of think about. One is the emergence of cultus, which was established in 1951, the Irish Music Organization, a nonprofit that was looking at the time to really encourage younger generations to get involved in Irish traditional music, as it was seen that it was gradually in decline due to lack of possible involvement and popularity. So they were quite interested in bringing this back, creating a sort of international social network over time of musicians and providing different resources for them. And eventually establishing the Fleadh Cheoil, as I had mentioned before, the Irish Music Festival and competitions, which proved extremely successful in their revival agenda, and really helped to provide the groundwork for creating the emergence and popularity of Irish traditional music that we would see later on in the 60s. In the late 50s and early 60s, we have Sean O'Riordan, who's an academic at UCC, a composer of Western art music, with a keen interest in different musics of the world, and particularly Irish traditional music. And his setting in a sort of cosmopolitan setting of Irish traditional music in a group format like this was revolutionary. Many of the musicians you see here would eventually go on to form the Chieftains, including Bodhrán player Peadar Mercier, and you can see here he is with his Bodhrán. And there's some actual photos as well of O'Riordan playing the Bodhrán as well. But this is really important because not only does this create, well, it creates a number of things. One, you have a group format. It's staged and orchestrated. It's not necessarily the solo tradition. We see an interaction of these different instruments. There's a harkening back to older texts that would have had tunes and sort of thinking about them and arranging them in a cosmopolitan manner. There's the inclusion of the Bodhrán here, which would have been many people's first exposure to it, particularly outside of Ireland, but to a degree in Ireland. Particularly once Culture-Colin musicians, such as, you got Sean Keane there, Peadar Mercier as well, Paddy Maloney, I believe that's him there all the way over there, would continue some of what O'Riordan had imparted to them in the Chieftains. And so their performances and recordings became extremely popular. As the Chieftains started recording in the mid-60s, and Peadar Mercier's on their recordings, I believe up until 1976, this is people's exposure to the drum. And when we think about the role of, say, Peadar Mercier here, he would have been playing the drum unmuted, and with a very thick handmade conical shaped tipper. So it had a booming quality to it. It was very loud and accompanied music quite well, and he would follow the rhythmic patterns of the melodies. But this was many people's first exposure to this drum, which is kind of interesting to think about, him sort of setting the tone. And so if we think about some of the early musical roles of this drum, I mean, prior to this, there's the ritual processional aspect of it with the Wren Boys in places like Sligo, which is known for sort of hand striking. You would have had that performance practices of people playing, particularly more outside than inside, with the drum. But what's interesting to think about with hand striking is that some of the flesh on the hand, when it hits the drum, I mean, you can get a bit of an attack with the nail, but when the fingers are coming down and hitting the drum, there's a natural dampening just from the knuckles and the skin there and some of the fat hitting that skin. So it's not quite as loud, even if it's unmuted, where the hand is just holding the frame drum and not putting it on the back of the skin. It's not quite as loud if you take that process and then apply a very heavy tipper. As we saw from the Wren Boy procession, that one fellow that had a very thick tipper to hit the skin with. I mean, if you're outdoors, that makes a lot of sense because it's outdoor drumming. It's a march or a ritual march. However, when you apply that to something like this, as we see here on the concert stage, indoors, it has a booming sound. So you're not muting it, and then you're hitting it quite hard with a thick tipper. And so there's a change there in terms of the sound. There's a change in terms of the context here as on the stage as opposed to either in a house or outside, and a change in attack, whether it's not the hand, but it's a tipper here. So it's interesting to think about that role, because if this, with these recordings and the prominence of the chieftains, this would have been a lot of people's exposure to this. If you take this and think about moving this forward into, say, people developing and thinking about, well, what exactly is the role of the bodhrán? It's, if Peadar Mercier is your prototype, then you would find a lot of players playing in that style. If you're thinking about sessions indoor, having a booming drum in which you're not muting the back can be problematic. And so you're going to, particularly in a small enclosed space where you're not outside, processing and you're indoors, you could see how that might be a little grating. It might be overpowering to the primary function of the tradition there, which is playing the tunes. And if the percussion instrument is accompanying that, that's fine. But if it's overpowering it in terms of volume, you could understand why there might be some stigma or criticism towards bodhrán players, which we will discuss a little bit later. But thinking about some of these roles and its relationship in terms of the hierarchy of Irish traditional music, it's quite interesting. If we're thinking about that and thinking about this sort of the prototype of having the bodhrán but unmuted, hitting it with a stick, which has sort of a booming resonant sound, one of the ways to approach that and solve that issue is thinking about muting the drum. And so muting it, either having the skin, the front part of the skin rest against the body more, but also thinking about using the hand, instead of just letting it ring out, putting the hand on the back and being able to slide up and down, getting glissandos, changing the pitch. And obviously, Johnny Ringo McDonagh was an innovator in terms of that, credited with really starting to mute and adjust the sound with the backhand on the back of the skin, adjusting different harmonics you can get, different notes, and bringing down the volume of it, potentially playing with a less thick tipper, so you don't have quite as much of a booming sound. And also Johnny McDonagh would eventually, in a further effort to mute the drum, would put black electrical tape around the front end of the drum, which would reduce some of the extra harmonics you would get naturally from a sounding frame drum, but also brings down the volume and further mutes it. So you can see that the move from sort of a booming, unmuted drum to one that is muted. And so there's certainly a shift there in terms of approaches there. And obviously Johnny McDonagh, coming in the 70s, not only brings this sort of different sound to the bodhrán, but is also influenced by the music he's listening to on the radio in terms of pop and whatnot. And so you start to have a different sort of understanding of the drum and approach to it. The popularity of the drum would continue, obviously. There was other sort of Celtic music ensembles, if you will, notable Scottish bands, the Boys of the Loch, with Robin Morton, Silly Wizards, Gordon Jones, even the Tannahill Weavers with Phil Smiley, would incorporate this drum. One of the issues with the drum that had to be resolved during this time period, as you have more players gaining interest in the drum, one of the issues was tuning. And here's Peadar Mercier here, as you can close in there just to kind of see the playing. I think we here have, second, two other drums there as well. And I love that he's got the chieftain's name on the drum there. And there's Johnny Ringo McDonagh muting the drum. So if you're curious about what that was looking like, there you go. So if we go back here for a second, if we're thinking about this development, and so one of the issues was tuning, is if you see this drum here, you can see that it looks like little tuning pegs are here. In older versions, this wasn't the case. And so this was another issue that kind of had to be resolved as we're looking at players trying to figure out how to get a consistent sound on the drum. Because the more you play the drum, the warmer it gets, the skin becomes more and more slack and the tone of the drum goes down. Obviously, if you're playing in a very dry climate and it hasn't been played much, it's quite taut, has a higher pitch. So trying to have a consistent drum sound was an issue. And we'll dig into one of the ways that this was resolved in terms of tuning systems. So thinking about these different aspects of drum playing, bodhrán playing, that were problematic, it's important to think about the hurdles that a lot of these earlier players would have had to overcome. With players like Johnny, Ringo, McDonagh, you also have a greater sense of virtuosic playing. One of the first bodhrán solos you can hear on a recording with him playing with Bodhrán, and just the speed and ability to articulate different rhythms on the drums is really clear in his playing, and it's a step forward in terms of technical mastery. And this would continue as players sought to develop this. You'd have in the 1980s, you see the emergence of different players, Mossy Griffin, Cole Murphy, a variety of musicians coming out and playing more and more virtuosically. You're also seeing a shift here in terms of professionalization, as many of these drummers here are playing with groups, a la the Culture-Colin format, playing Irish traditional music, but playing on the stage as well. So it's not just sessions, it's not just in the house or the older crossroad dances, but they're happening on the stage. And for audiences, obviously. So there's a different change in the performance context that's going on there. And with this sort of virtuosic groups that are playing, the bodhrán playing is also raised by some of these masters of percussion here. So we see this sort of virtuosic playing continue into the 90s as you have the sort of river dance craze and the explosion of Irish traditional music around the globe from that. You have more and more sort of super groups or super trad groups that are coming out. You have wonderful players like Junior Davey, obviously, and his bodhrán schools and bodhrán recordings, bringing the drum to just a different level in terms of articulating different sounds on the drum, reconceptualizing ways of mapping these rhythms on the drum. Obviously, guys like John Joe Kelly with Fluke, furthering this as well with the idea of the bodhrán solo, thinking about sort of mapping these rhythms in relation almost like a drum kit. And John Doe talks about this a bit, and the ideas of grooves and incorporating different rhythms. Some of the drums, obviously, as well as we'll get into this with making, are being changed, particularly customized for drummers. I mean, you can see just in this picture from the 80s of Cole Murphy here playing a drum versus the one we have of Junior Davey here, to the one that even John Joe Kelly is playing here with these sort of tuning systems we can see. So, and this further continues. I mean, you have, inspired by John Joe Kelly, you have another generation, Colin Phelan and Eamon Murray, etc. A whole wide variety of players, and I could sit here all day listing them, but that have really inspired the progression of the drum playing, and particularly in this professional environment where virtuosity is prized. And so thinking about developing solos, developing different drumming approaches that are quite important. And so we'll dig into the role of this, but it's interesting to kind of see the progression and have an idea of this, because when we're talking about bodhrán making as well, there's a relational dynamic that's going on there between the drummer and the drum maker, and sort of the intermediary there is the drum. So tuning was one of the issues that I had mentioned was a hurdle, and it's a serious issue. I mean, when we think about this, if you had a drum in the wintertime and it was too dry, it almost have a brittle sound to it, and you could rub water into it to kind of slacken it a bit. And conversely, if it's too slack, too loose, you could put it near a flame to kind of dry it up a bit and to tighten it up. So for people who are trying to have consistent bodhrán sound and to be able to really play consistently with the skin so that it was at a certain tension, there was a push to have a tuning system. And so one of the people credited with creating these tuning systems is the bodhrán maker Seamus O'Kane, and a great bodhrán player as well, who had an engineering mind for the for really building these drums. As a shop teacher as well, he had a good understanding of constructing things and was interested in tinkering with things and breaking them down and understanding the sort of scientific underpinnings of drum making. And so he's really responsible of thinking about creating a tuning system. And not only creating one tuning system, and we have here, this is photos from a visit I took when we went to his workshop of just the bodhrán mold, and of course one of the early examples of his tuning system here. And this is about, if we're thinking about bodhrán making with Seamus O'Kane, really starts experimenting with it into the 1970s, but with bodhrán making and timbre design, but thinking about it not just in terms of solving tuning, but thinking about experimenting with the drum in general. So experimentation with tuning system also includes experimenting with skins, types, treatments, stretching, with shell design in terms of size, thickness, diameter, depth, and construction, and timbre design as well. And so there's a number of sort of tuning systems. One was sort of conceptualized based off George McCann of Cookstown County, Tyrone. This is about 1980s, which involved an 8-point tuning system. And so we have this is the drum we just saw in the previous slide. This is one of the earliest attempts at a tuning system here, where you can see it looks like we have screws here. Here's another tuning system we can see as well, where you have these sliders for skin tensioning. And so the key here is to be able to push the skin tension to a certain point where it will remain. And we have different tuning systems we can see here as well. Attempt at sort of a latch. We have here another one, and then we can see here on the very bottom, this one that squeezes the drum from the outside. So it's interesting to kind of think about these different designs of whether they're knobs or sort of a single screw rack and tensioning system, or an outside tensioning system, of sort of tinkering with these things and experimenting and seeing what works best. And it's quite important to think about, because this desire to further the drum is really important for an emerging market as it becomes, the bodhrán gains in popularity, but also thinking about as Irish traditional music became more and more professionalized, the number of players looking for high quality drums that were tunable, that were reliable, and that they could order multiple ones as they would go through them throughout the year due to a touring schedule. So that sort of idea of experimenting with these things coincides with a greater demand and a greater interest in the drum as well. I think it's interesting to kind of think about, if we're looking at this sort of approach, of a scientific approach, of an intellectual curiosity with the construction of a drum, of testing the different sort of acoustics of the drum scientifically and measuring them, which is something Seamus O'Kane did, is thinking about how to further the drum in terms of its playability, in terms of its reliability, coming from a maker who is also a player. So being able to self-test the drum is really important. And this sort of intellectual curiosity and desire to experiment with bodhrán designs really lays the groundwork for a number of makers to come, such as Christian Hedwitschak, Rob Fortner, Darius Bartlett, Dave Settles, etc., that were looking at experimenting with this. And we're going to take a look at that shortly. Good. Now, one of the things I did want to discuss, as I mentioned this earlier, is thinking about, we talked about tuning systems here and organological experimentation and innovation. And so I'm not going to dive into this concept too much, but I wanted to sort of flesh it out a bit so you have an idea. Trying to understand and make sense of the experiments that have gone on with Bodhrán making, using different skins, whether it's donkey or kangaroo or goat, greyhound, etc. Shell depth, how deep the drum is, right? The materials, the composite materials, is the metal shell, wood, what type of wood? If we're thinking about just in terms of the design, like is it a circular head? Is it oval? Is it a teardrop? There's just a variety of approaches. And then we're thinking about in terms of tippers, meaning the sticks that we hit the drum with. Is it sort of hot rod, where it's like skewers taped together? Does the stick have a split head? How thick is it? What type of wood is it made out of? Are we using brushes? What about approaching the skin on the back with the hand? Or using other technologies to adjust the sound? Miking it, running it through effects, etc. There's a whole world of approaches to getting different sounds out of the drum. One of the ways when we think about particularly Bodhrán making, one way to conceptualize this is something called the social construction of technology. This is really a sort of academic framework for thinking about how we design certain technologies and why they become set in the way they are. You can think about this in terms of, say, bicycle making. When bicycles were being designed, there was a period of experimentation of different size wheels and materials, etc. And after a period of time, the design is sort of socially agreed upon by different actors who have different senses of agency regarding that and provide different information to inform that this certain design, say of a bicycle, becomes stable, and then it's sort of closed. It becomes accepted that this is the way in which bicycles will be made. Well, the same thing can be said about Bodhráns. It's the same sort of concept that different people, social actors, contribute to the creation of and design of the Bodhrán. So this comes from makers. This comes from, you may get feedback from people who are listening. You get it from players. And so we'll see in this portion of the lecture just experimentations with the drum. That it hasn't necessarily reached a stabilized Bodhrán making platform. It hasn't reached a sense of closure where this is set. Is it a frame drum? Sure, but the nature of how big the heads are, the measurements, the shape of it, the materials, is still a process that's being worked out. And so the Bodhrán player is informing some of that. The drum is sort of the nature of, and design of the drum is impacting the way in which players approach it. The relationships between maker and player is also really important. That dynamic of whether a Bodhrán maker is customizing it for a player, whether there's constant feedback so that the drum is being designed and redesigned and tweaked based on the specifications expressed by the player. All this contributes to the social construction of the Bodhrán. And so I sort of argue, and I won't be going too deep into that for today's talk, but I think it's important to think about is what dynamics are informing instrument making, in this case the Bodhrán, and the way in which we may get to a point where Bodhrán design has become completely stabilized and closed. How long that process will take. Obviously, this is you can argue this in a variety of different ways, but I feel, based on what we will see here, that it's still in a process of development, that it hasn't reached that sort of closure just yet. So it's sort of some framework to think about as we dive into some of the experiments. So let's talk a bit about the dynamics between maker and performer. This relationship is really important when we think about the different ways in which these relationships take place and how they impact playing, Bodhrán making. And particularly thinking about the development of the Bodhrán as a technological artifact. There's a dynamic process there. So we'll dive into two stories based off of interviews here with Ossie Griffin and also with Tommy Hayes here on the right. And this here is a photo Ossie provided, performing on a Charlie Byrne Bodhrán. So if you remember the maker Charlie Byrne, Turles County, Tipperary, was highly regarded. And so he's there playing a Charlie Byrne Bodhrán, and Tommy Hayes was also a fan of Charlie Byrne Bodhráns. And he's here playing with the flautist, Gary Shannon. So there's a symbiotic relationship that occurs between the Bodhrán and the player when we think about that. Griffin remarked the idea that the player breaks in the Bodhrán, but the Bodhrán also breaks in the player. He explained that the Bodhrán is still breaking us in, that battle that Mossy Griffin started 35 years ago with the Charlie Byrne's Bodhrán is still going on, but in different forms. And he was talking about just not only the relationship between player and drum, how the construction of that drum impacts the way in which the player approaches it, conceptualizes it in terms of what's possible sonically, but that there's this back and forth between the drum's impact on the player and then the player's impact on the drum, the way in which the drum is played and treated. It's really important to think about that in terms of that relationship. In discussions with Hayes and Griffin, they regard their involvement with Bodhrán maker Charlie Byrne to be quite unique. Having this connection with the maker was integral to acquiring a superior Bodhrán, particularly finding a Bodhrán that was suited to their needs. And there was a discussion of sort of having an understanding of the maker's personality. For example, Tommy Hayes relayed the idea that he knew the maker would often hide his most finely constructed Bodhráns from view, and that in the shed, in the back room where you could go to check them out, he knew that Byrne had specifically hid certain ones that he highly prized. And so then it was sort of necessary for Hayes to kind of work with Byrne until he could find the best drums. Hayes sort of comically said it could be a Bodhrán hid underneath, the bed, or hidden here or there, and that you really had to work with the maker to get the drum. So this is the idea of Byrne's making a wide number of drums and then kind of having to sift through it and negotiate with the maker in order to get the drum that you're really looking for. And so this social connection, the sort of intermediary, is the drum. The cause for having this social interaction is to play the drum and acquire the drum. And this is not necessarily the only way in which these relationships take place, as we'll see, but it's one way in which you have the drummer coming to the maker who has already made the drum without customizing it for the player's certain tastes and aesthetics, but that player has to actually really sift through and figure out and negotiate how to get the best drum from the maker. Sort of going in the opposite direction here, and thinking about this relationship is important, is thinking about the maker, Christian Hedwitschak. Again, thinking about, with Hedwitschak, we have a desire to customize certain drums for professional players. Hedwitschak himself produces drums full-time, which is sort of a rarity amongst Bodhrán making, although it's slowly moving that way as there's a greater market and demand for the drums. And so if we think about, say, something like a Fender guitar, where they have signature series, right, the Eric Clapton or the Jimi Hendrix version, etc., Hedwitschak adopted this same idea to have a signature series of drums customized to certain professional players' specifications, and then to create a large number of these so that different Bodhrán players could acquire them. And so you can find this with players such as Martin O'Neill or Eamon Murray, Ralph Waggles, Cormac Byrne. He was also one for Johnny McDonagh as well. I think there's even a drum in honor of Charlie Byrne as well. But it is kind of interesting. We'll dive into some of the relational dynamics between this. So if we see here, the first one we'll dive into here is with Eamon Murray. And you can see, obviously, there's the tuning system. And there, interestingly enough, there's the one crossbar, which is unique to his design. Something that we see over time, that the crossbar, because it was initially used to be held for processional purposes, over time some people found it got in the way of really moving your hand around. Murray said that it was helpful for using to pressure against to move the skin. But in an interview, Eamon discussed that he had paired up with Hedwitschak 10 to 12 years ago, and he wanted something that was quick and easy to tune with a lambic head that gave you more attack. And what would happen is Hedwitschak would create a couple of prototypes, and then Eamon Murray would sort of road test them at different gigs. And this would go back and forth for a number of months, and Murray would give, certain feedback to Hedwitschak to customize the drum, whether it's the frame or the tuning systems or etc., until he had gotten exactly what he was interested in. Martin O'Neill discussed a similar process. At the time, he was playing a 12-inch drum from a maker in Wales, possibly England, and he was interested, particularly Hedwitschak was interested in this small 12-inch drum in terms of the diameter of the head. And so, again, Martin O'Neill sort of discusses with Hedwitschak the certain specifications he wanted, the way, whether it was the tape around the head to mute certain overtones, the shape of the frame, the depth, in order to get the sounds he's looking for. Even just the nature of the skin, the treatment, and how thick and where he wants certain portions of the skin to be in terms of thinking about the spine, how thin or thick is also really important. I have here another one as well here with Ralph Waggles, and you can see again taped, muting the overtones. Similar process, thinking about what the player is looking for, and going back and forth with the feedback is really quite important here. The Cormac Byrne drum is also quite interesting if we're thinking about that relationship of how the player is really informing the construction, and thinking about tuning systems and thinking about aesthetics as well is really important. In terms of just kind of getting the sound you would want. Which is interesting to think about is in a discussion with Cormac Byrne, once again, same sort of system of sending out a drum, these are specifications I'm looking for, road testing it, giving feedback. I thought one of the things he was quite interesting, and this is a quote from Cormac Byrne, was that he said that Cormac would give Hedwitschak feedback via email or phone. And he would ask, Hedwitschak was interested in finding out different things in terms of the brightness of the drum, the sound of the attack, the top end, etc. And so Hedwitschak, in providing a means for Cormac Byrne to provide sort of meaningful feedback, he said to him, imagine you have a mixing desk in front of you. You have top end, bottom end, high, mids, lows, attacks, different effects. Tell me where the drum is in terms of these different parameters between 1 and 10, and then tell me where you want it to be. And so this is sort of a clear way of being able to articulate exactly what you're looking to get out of the drum. And so Hedwitschak has had a lot of different designs. I know he himself, in a discussion with him and Ralph Waggles, had discussed even going to the University of Munich's Laboratory of Acoustics and Dynamics to discuss measuring the acoustics of different skin heads, shell depth, etc., to sort of provide scientific grounding for some of these innovations as well. So we see a continuity there. We were talking about O'Kane's interest in scientific testing as well of acoustics to a degree, and an interest in innovation and experimentation with Bodhrán design, and it continues right through Hedwitschak here as well, which is interesting to think about. There's a whole wide range of drums produced by Hedwitschak with different designs, so it's worth taking a look at. I'm not going to go into each one, but I thought it was interesting, particularly thinking about the relational dynamics that's going on here, of player having a greater say in the way in which a drum is constructed, as opposed to sort of the older methods of just producing drums and then the player coming in and kind of selecting the one they see best suits them. Now, another one, sticking here with Cormac Byrne for a second, we see here the maker John Blackwell. And these are interesting drums in that Blackwell here is playing outside, who plays Morris dancing, performs for Morris dancing, I should say. And so one of the concerns there is if you're playing outdoors and it starts raining or drizzling or it's quite wet, having a traditional Bodhrán for that would not necessarily be preferable. So having a metal frame with a plastic synthetic head would be. And so these are not the only drums that are out there. I know there's a number of makers that are using synthetic heads, from Hedwitschak to Cooperman, Ringo, etc. And you can find these technologies used on snare drums as well, and a variety of percussion instruments to have these sort of plastic synthetic heads. But Blackwell ended up teaming up with Cormac Byrne to sort of create this drum. Byrne had relayed in an interview that he was playing one of these drums for a recording and ended up grabbing a pint glass and sliding it along the back. And we'll talk about applying different things to the drum later. Ronan O'Snowd is quite famous for putting a metal pipe and sliding it along the back end of the drum to create different sounds. And Byrne did this with a pint glass and enjoyed the sound. And so they decided to design, as you can see here, sort of a black aluminum pint glass to recreate this sort of sound, which I thought was really interesting. And you can see here there's sort of a tabla-inspired spot there for hitting as well, and a custom tipper, which I know is made by Stephen Moises, the great tipper maker, who he in himself has been developing a wide range of tippers, which is quite fascinating to look at. We're not going to dive into every one of those, but the book does cover more of that in terms of experimentation in tipper making and whatnot. And so this drum was developed over time, sort of communicating between Blackwell and Byrne, and a similar process of road testing them at gigs and sort of fine-tuning the design and the tuning system. And Byrne and Blackwell agreed to sort of describe this drum as the talking Bodhrán. So, if you're familiar with the talking drum from West Africa, you find it in Nigeria, Ghana, etc., you can get some incredible pitch shifts in it. And so with the ability to slide that aluminum pint glass along the drum, you're able to sort of quickly get some dramatic pitch shifts there, and thus that was the inspiration for this sort of drum. Now, moving along, another interesting relationship that existed here, which I think is important to touch upon, is that here we have Colin Phelan, who, when he was studying at UL, decided to actually do an apprenticeship with the maker Darius Bartlett, and went the further step of not only getting feedback and giving feedback to Bartlett, but actually went to his workshop and studied how to make a drum, which is a dramatic departure in the sense of going from player to maker, and so this is the drum here that was made by Colin Phelan, and you can see there's a sort of a symbol here, which is great, but there's a sort of a learning the actual craft in order to get the sort of drum you're looking for is quite an interesting step forward in terms of understanding drum construction and being able to really articulate clearly what one is after, aesthetically speaking, in terms of how to get that based on drum construction. Phelan also forged a working relationship with Bodhrán maker and player Rob Faulkner, and also went down to Faulkner's studio and experimented with different designs and skin playing. Faulkner has a number of relationships with professional drummers, such as Robbie Walsh and Al Preston. And in an interview with him, he said, quote, "My relationship with Colin, Robbie, and Niall and all those guys has definitely pushed my making in a direction that really supports them. And that was a mutual thing. I was interested in exploiting the materials for what they're worth and helping them to amplify aspects of their playing that they wanted. It's a challenge for me to make something that pushes them, and they gave me feedback on how that feeds into their playing." Faulkner further discussed building drums that could further players' techniques based on what he heard in select performances. Now, Rob Faulkner, inspired by Darius Bartlett's experimentations with Bodhrán design, started using kangaroo skins, goat skins, calf skins, etc. on these and experimenting with shell depths, composite materials such as various woods, epoxies, fibers, drumhead diameters, and inlays there. So, and even weight of the drum. And so we have some of these designs, these extreme shell depths. This one happens to be a double-headed Bodhrán. Thinking about getting greater tonal directionality and resonance with a sort of shell depth like this for miking really shows, once again, a continuation in the desire to experiment with different aspects of Bodhrán construction to change the sound and to see sort of possibilities, the creativity of Bodhrán design as well here. Faulkner also worked with the maker David Settles, who's out of Calgary. Settles is quite a creative maker as well, and we'll see some of these designs here. And when I was talking about the social construction of technology earlier, and saying that Bodhrán design hasn't fully, stabilized and sort of become closed as a design, I think this gives evidence to that. I mean, you can see here sort of an oval shape, a figure eight, a teardrop, and Settles himself plays and talked about how, say, something like this would give him greater space to move his hand around the drum and shape the sounds. And I know that Settles worked with Faulkner, in which Faulkner agreed to produce a drum head for an oval Bodhrán, and Settles would produce the shell. And so you can really see the sort of joy in creating these drums, one-of-a-kind drums. I'm sure you could probably custom order them. But just seeing what's possible, using different materials, skins, and sounds to get different a different end result here. If we're thinking about Bodhrán design, we're now going to move on to the last part of the lecture, which is going to be thinking about performance practices and particularly musical roles. So this is just a picture of a session here, myself playing up on Bill Bach in the Bronx. And so we're going to be thinking about interpretive flexibility, which is sort of an academic way of talking about the way in which we make decisions about how we play, the choices we make. Stephen Feld offers, the ethnomusicologist, calls it interpretive moves. When we're thinking about the processes a musician goes through as he experiences and makes sense of a musical event or artifact. Feld sort of thinks about that one cannot engage with a musical event or artifact without simultaneously experiencing the musical reality and relating to it an extra musical reality structured and informed by the interaction and culmination of socio-cultural experiences. So basically, to put that in layman's terms, we cannot interact with a musical event or object without connoting previous musical experiences. And so we continually construct these interconnections between musical experiences that shape our expectations, aesthetics, audiations, and sort of the way in which we think about, in general, and understand music. So this is important when we're thinking about the way in which different players approach the drum, think of themselves in terms of their role, and then produce music. And whether there's an accompanist thinking of themselves is equal to a soloist. And so there's different parameters for sort of evaluating these experiences, whether we're thinking about the locational, where we sort of compare musical experiences with other similar musical experiences, the categorical, where we sort of group different musical experiences, associational, where we relate musical experiences to other stimuli. This can be both musical and non-musical. So, for example, with this photo, that we would think of the Bodhrán in relation to a session, providing a certain role, right, in a certain context. Reflective, which is sort of just thinking back on these musical experiences, and evaluative is just passing a value judgment on the musical experience itself. So, such as if you're rather conservative and you see a Bodhrán being played in a world percussion ensemble, you may balk at that, or at a solo, or if there was a extended use of the Bodhrán through electronics, etc. These things might ruffle the feathers, particularly the way in which we conceptualize the drum. And so that really informs how people play the drum, how they interpret it, and how they make sense of all this. And so I won't be digging too much in terms of theoretical constructs of interpretive moves by Feld, but it's a useful theoretical framework for kind of making sense of what's going on when we look at different bodhrán players and the choices they make. Now, I'd already outlined the roles of the bodhrán player. And if we're thinking about older traditional roles, we're thinking of a frame drum that is either played with the hand or with a tipper that is accompanying and trying to follow as closely as possible the rhythmic patterns of the melodies being played. There's a primacy that's given to the tunes, the melodies. That's considered the tradition in Irish traditional music. The bodhrán obviously cannot actually articulate those entire tunes in terms of the melodic portion of it. So it's following with the rhythmic, and obviously you can adjust and slide the hand as closely as possible. But so I think because in part of that, it's not able to pass on all the information of the tunes to another generation of musicians to pass that on, or to other musicians in general. It's given a secondary status. I mean, it's also because it was an older ritual instrument. It has sort of a secondary status. Its recent development and inclusion, particularly in sessions and Irish traditional music, in the sense of being there consistently, as opposed to, like I said, being a ritual instrument. It has that stigma. I think also because of the some of the older models that we saw, like when we talked about Peadar Mercier playing unmuted with a thick stick. If you take that from the stage, which is fine, and move to the context of a session, that could be overpowering and unpleasant. And so that once again could lead to a possible stigma in which the drum itself is seen in a secondary role. Hierarchically, it's at the bottom. And so, as the instrument and the players developed, particularly with techniques and mastery, and virtuosos and people playing at very high professional levels, there's sort of a backlash to that. There's a pushback from professional players down to people who are playing consistently, of a desire to have a greater validation of the drum. That it's not necessarily just a secondary instrument or something to be scoffed at. There's a classic Seamus Ennis joke that the best way to play a bodhrán is with a penknife. Well, if you're a professional musician who's playing all the time, or you're an accomplished drummer, having that sort of cultural view of the drum is a negative one, and one that you want to sort of change and shape potentially. And so I think there's a real push, and we're going to dive into that now, to reconceptualize the role of the drum from this older model of being sort of a secondary, auxiliary part of the tradition to being an important part of that, to being recognized as an instrument of great worth and not to be underrated. It's if we think about some of the desires to push back against maybe this older model, I think you really want to start potentially with McDonagh, and I had talked about his influence in terms of having a greater virtuosic mastery of the drum, his desire to mute the skin. Once again, you see a guy who's going more into sessions, also playing on the stage, but a desire to follow the tune more with the hand on the back, being able to do glissandos and different shifts in pitch. Taping the drum, so it's not as loud, it's not as booming, it's not quite as resonant, and some of those harsher overtones, depending on your aesthetic, I personally enjoy some of them, but and taping the drum to mute it a bit is quite important. There's a push, right, as I mentioned in the 80s, of bodhrán players like Cole Murphy, Tommy Hayes, Mosey Griffin, Jim Sutherland, Easy Club, to begin to challenge this older model of bodhrán playing. And one of the ways to challenge that, or to rethink the drum in terms of its role, in terms of the rhythms being played, is to look to non-traditional musics that have established percussion traditions. And so this means either possibly looking to Indian classical tabla music or North African frame drumming, jazz drumming. These are all great percussion traditions where the drum is highly prized. There's a high degree of mastery there, and a long tradition of accompaniment as well. And so you see percussionists drawing from different musics of the world in order to redefine their roles within a broader realm of percussion, as well as being within Irish traditional music. So this reconceptualization of the possible musical roles and percussive participation in traditional and non-traditional contexts led to the gradual shift in perception of the bodhrán by practitioners. I think this continual process of remolding the musical role and performance practices of the bodhrán was later adopted by players such as Ronan O'Snowda of Keela, Martin O'Neill, and Cormac Byrne. Through reconceptualizing the musical possibilities for the bodhrán, this altered players' interpretive moves, their decisions to incorporate certain patterns, certain sounds on the drum, certain approaches, or even rethinking the way in which they accompany. Or if they're even accompanying, are they on an equal footing with a melody player? You can see people like Tommy Hayes, who draws upon different musics of the world, including North African hand drumming, and applying some of those techniques to the drum itself. If you look at other players such as Ronan O'Snowda, Cormac Byrne, even John Joe Kelly, who has experimented with playing in non-traditional contexts, particularly Indian classical music. So you have Ronan playing with tabla, or same with John Joe Kelly with Zakir Hussain, or Cormac Byrne playing Indian classical music and Indian film music. And those sort of aesthetics are really key to influencing the approach to the drum itself. You have someone like Jim Sutherland, another one who, with Easy Club in the 80s, looked to jazz and fusing sort of Celtic traditional musics and jazz. And so not only is Sutherland creating his own solos, which he really popularized with Easy Club, but drawing upon different techniques and approaches that jazz drummers would have used and applying that to the drum. He went so far as creating his own sort of jazz brush tipper for the bodhrán, so that you get that shh type sound that you might get from a jazz brush. He went so far as to do that as well. So applying different materials to the drum head to get different sounds, imitative of jazz drumming, which is important. Thinking along those same lines about conceptualizing the bodhrán as a drum kit, where you have the bass drum, the middle, the hi-hat, the kick drum. This is something that has helped shape a number of drummers' approach. For Martin O'Neill, really thinking about really mapping that out from the clicky percussive notes you can get similar to a hi-hat, to muting it in the middle to the snare, to getting the low bass drum. There's a discussion of trying to get as close as possible to that. John Joe Kelly, another one who's thinking about sort of approaching the bodhrán like a drum kit at times, groove bass drumming, and thinking about how to play different beats outside of Irish traditional music and applying them to the bodhrán head. On similar lines, we can also think about John Joe Kelly's great use of bodhrán solos on a stage context, and really popularizing sort of top-end virtuosic playing that we find in a lot of those solos. Once again, professional musician on the stage, and incorporating the solo, which is something you wouldn't necessarily see too often in a session or in that sort of context, but on the stage, harking back to, say, solos you'd find in non-traditional traditions, from jazz to Indian classical music, etc. And Cormac Byrne, inspired by Trilak Gurtu, who placed his tabla at the center of this sort of world music-inspired drum kit, has done the same, where he's sitting in front of a drum kit and has the bodhrán there along with other percussion instruments as the accompanist there. So it's interesting to think about this balance between non-traditional and Irish traditional music, and trying to make sense of that. I mean, the other important thing to think about this is this idea of polymusicality, where you're drawing from different traditions, that you're functional in different traditions. A number of players, such as Eamon Murray, Colin Phelan, Martin O'Neill, having gone to music school, either in the sort of University of Limerick Conservatory model or other places, Cormac Byrne teaching a variety of percussion traditions. These are people who have studied a variety of percussion traditions, and then that's informing their playing. So it's a different approach than just playing the tunes, but thinking about themselves in relation to a larger world music percussion traditions is quite important to think about. Here's Tommy Hayes there, obviously the cosmopolitan approach. And this is a great album to check out as well with Antara, is thinking about that balance between traditional and non-traditional with Matthew Noon is quite important. Once again, Jim Sutherland there in terms of thinking about the drum solos, which now is quite common to see. And it's almost expected when we see a Bodhrán player on the stage in Irish traditional music that there'll be some sort of solo that'll happen here. There's John Joe Kelly as well. So, acoustic applications. So we see here on the left Ronan O'Snodda of Keela, and of course Brian Fleming, great Bodhrán player as well, applying different technologies to the drum itself. And in this sense, we have the metal pipe that you can get these great glissandos that inspired Cormac Byrne to kind of create that, to use the pint glass and then the aluminum pint glass. And we also see the same thing here by Brian Fleming, another who is also listed in the book and kind of explores his creative approach to the drum solo as well. I won't get into that now, but it's important to think about. Just the idea of applying different materials to the drum, whether it's a jazz brush or a pipe, to get different sounds out of it, the different tippers approach in terms of the construction of those and the materials used, and other ideas based on either acoustic in nature, to change the sound of the drum is quite important. I mean, at first when you see the sliding of a pipe against the bodhrán, it's quite shocking. That's become somewhat commonplace in the sense of experimenting with the sound and seeing what you can do with it. There's also the idea of using a different stick on the back end of the drum, which of course Ronan O'Snodda has popularized as well to a degree, and kind of thinking about having two drumsticks going at the same time is quite interesting. Before I dive into electronic applications, it's also important to think about the role of the bodhrán in non-traditional musics, but thinking about it in terms of composition. If we look at the work of Steve Foreman, the studio percussionist, touring musician, Western art music composer, and bodhrán player, he's really was inspired by the drum's versatility and recent introduction in the realm of world percussion. And so Steve Foreman, who's now currently, I believe, at the Royal Conservatory of Scotland in Glasgow, has composed chamber ensemble and orchestral works that prominently feature the bodhrán. And so while these compositions are couched in sort of a 20th century approach to chamber music writing, devoid of the familiar trappings associated with Irish traditional music, the bodhrán is given a central spot in terms of the works. So it's worth thinking about that in terms of departing from Irish traditional music and seeing the drum possibly as not only a solo instrument, but being put out front in these larger non-traditional works. Now, last but not least, we can think about the application of electronics and music technology to the drum. And this ranges in a variety of ways. I mean, we see here, this is Ronan O'Snodda playing the wave drum, so taking an electronic drum and playing it like a bodhrán to get different sounds out of it. There's also the mixing the bodhrán through effects, or whether it's loop pedals or different effects pedals, connecting the bodhrán with certain electronic synthesizer drum pedals also happens. So a blending electroacoustic approach to this occurs as well. A discussion of even running it through wah-wah pedals and tremolo pedals and having electronic music triggers on the head of the bodhrán has also been occurring. Ronan O'Snodda was talking about some of the exciting possibilities of this. And the University of Limerick has actually even created a virtual bodhrán called the Bodhrán, which is a musical interface that's based on gestural control. So you would move your hands as if you're playing the Bodhrán, and then based on those gestures, you would pick up different sounds and could assign different sounds to those gestures. So in closing, I hope this was a benefit to the people listening. It's a wide range of things going on in the world of Bodhrán playing, innovations occurring, experimentations happening, and this is continuing. And so this is really a preview to kind of give you an insight into some of the research I've been doing and thinking about the book in it of itself, which further explores this. Many of the things you may have questions about, further wonderings are explored in there. And so at the end of this, I put up my email and two publications, the book and another article that's based on the Bodhrán making of Seamus O'Kane. And so if you have any questions, you can shoot them to me. I'd be happy to discuss this with anybody who's passionate about this sort of research and about the Bodhrán, et cetera, Irish trad. The music's beyond that. And I'll leave some links in the comment section as well, so you can explore some of this information. In terms of the recital, initially when this was booked, pre-COVID, there was just going to be a performance which would have been filmed. What I'm going to do here is put clips from a previously recorded concert I gave for CUNY Irish Studies, which I was playing Bodhrán. And so hopefully it'll give you some, you can watch the use of different tippers, accompaniment approaches to songs. It's in a Irish traditional music setting. It is on the stage, and a Bodhrán solo. And so this will give you an insight into some of the ways in which, if you're not familiar with Bodhrán playing, it can occur, and if you are, you can watch it and listen to it. But at this point, I wanted to thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing any feedback from you. Thank you to Queen's College Irish Studies and the music departments for supporting this. It comes to that point, at the low point of the concert, where they ask the drummer to play something. The Byrne solo is a relatively recent addition. It has nothing to particularly do with Campaneo, but it does just in terms of trad, which particularly comes from the stage. You find this early recordings like Easy Club, that should be Southern, and later Council Kelly, and a whole assortment of others. To make this more interesting, let me see here. We'll see all the musicians we have in the audience today, so it terrifies some of you. It's good. Keep on your toes. So let's see. I'll give you a phrase, okay, and you clap it back. Okay, so it's just like a drummer. I'll give this to you, and I'll weave it in here, and when you hear it, I expect you to clap. Is everyone on board with this? Is everyone on board with this? Yes. Yeah, no, I can tell it's not. That's all right. I'm going to do this anyways. This is most of my day in school anyways. So the breakdown works like this. You just do clap, nothing, clap, nothing, clap, nothing, clap, nothing, clap, 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 clap. You think y'all can handle that? Maybe let's try it together one more time. I'm going to play it on the drum, and when you hear it, you can help me. If you don't, well, let's try it. You'll be clapping for me anyway, so it's happy. Here we go. One last time. Here we go. 1, 2, ready, go. Nothing, 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 nothing. Okay, very good.
There's an extra clap over there.
There's a few errant claps out there, but that's okay. That's very. I expect that. There's a few people just giving me cold, hard stares, which is nothing new. So that. Let's see here.